In the history of all things motorsport, there are many ways a driver or a rider can lose a race in the weirdest way possible. From drivers running out of fuel on the last lap with just a few laps to go, to competitors celebrating too early, whether that was down to them not realising they still had one lap left, or whether they thought they were far ahead of the car behind them, leading to them slowing down too much and allowing them to overtake before the start-finish line. These are some examples, but the one that we are talking about today might be one that you would think would be unlikely to happen. One where fans of a certain rider would end up costing said rider from taking the win at their home race. This is the story of when fans cost Alex Criville from winning the 1996 Spanish Motorcycle Grand Prix. During the mid to late 90s, it's safe to say that MotoGP was going through a similar stage to what they are going through right now, in that one manufacturer was dominating the landscape of the sport. But rather than it being Ducati, who are the ones currently dominating the sport nowadays, it was Honda that was dominating the series during that decade, specifically the Repsol Honda team, with their all-star lineup of reigning two-time champion that year Mick Doohan and Spain's #1 rider at the time Alex Criville. The pair first became teammates in 1994, with Criville moving over from the Pons team, where he took his first ever 500cc win in 1992, to join the factory team alongside Doohan, who had been with the team since the beginning of his MotoGP career, and Shinichi Ito, who made his full-time debut in the Premier class the year before. Probably worth noting that during this time, the factory team used to run at least 3 riders, as opposed to 2. The season would essentially act as a bit of a learning year for Alex, with him getting to grips with being in a factory environment, with him getting better as the season went on, with him grabbing 3 podiums in the middle part of the season to finish 6th in the standings ahead of Ito, who was only 3 points behind him come the end of the season. But the pair would end up getting overshadowed by their more experienced teammate Doohan, who would go on to dominate the championship that year to win his first ever Premier Class title, beating nearest rival and Yamaha rider Luca Cadalora in the end by a massive 143 points. 1995 would end up being an improvement for Criville, with him bettering his 1994 finishing position by finishing the year in 4th place, with him picking up double the amount of podiums he got the previous year and even grabbing his first ever pole position at Assen. But once again, he would end up getting outclassed by his teammate Doohan, as although he would have a slight challenge from fellow compatriot Daryl Beattie, he would go on to retain his title, beating the Suzuki rider in the end by 33 points. But for Alex, the high point of the year would end up coming at the finale in Barcelona, as in his second home Grand Prix of the season, he would go on to take his first ever win as a factory Honda rider, just edging out his other teammate Shinichi Ito by only a 1/10 of a second. This win for Criville would end up injecting a ray of confidence into him, as going into 1996, he would end up taking the fight to his senior teammate Doohan, thanks in large to Honda having a dominant package compared to the other manufacturers in the field, which even allowed their satellite teams to also fight towards the front. But initially, the first 2 races wouldn't be anything to write home about for Alex, as in the first race at the Shah Alam circuit in Malaysia, he would end up crashing out of the race at the first corner after only completing 2 laps, in a race which saw Doohan being strangely off the pace down in 5th. Criville would then finish 4th at the next race at Sentul, with teammate Doohan going on to win the race, while Suzuka would see Criville having the edge on Doohan, with him finishing 2nd after grabbing his 2nd ever pole position, whilst Doohan would again be off the pace down in 6th. Then came the next race in Jerez, which would play host to one of the most strangest finishes to a Grand Prix, and would also essentially be the starting point of the Doohan-Criville inter-team rivalry. Heading into the Spanish Grand Prix, the atmosphere at the circuit was immense, with many rooting for home hero Alex Criville. but during qualifying he would have to settle for second on the grid, being beaten by teammate Doohan, who would grab pole position. But at the start, Criville would be able to get the jump on Doohan off the line, but at the same time would also get jumped by the Kanemoto Honda of Luca Cadalora, who would get a lightning start from 6th on the grid. But immediately, Criville would perform the switchback on Cadalora to take the lead off the Italian before the approach to turn 2, whilst Doohan on the other hand would end up losing another 2 places. Firstly to the Polari Honda of Alex Barros at turn 2, and then the IP Aprilia of Doriano Romboni around the outside of turn 5. A corner later, and Cadalora would retake the lead off Criville into the heavy braking zone, whilst Doohan would regain 4th from Romboni as a result of the Italian going deep into the corner. A lap later, and Doohan would come under pressure from his fellow compatriot Daryl Beattie, but this wouldn't last too long as the Suzuki rider would end up going deep into turn 6, losing a lot of places in the process. He wouldn't be the only one having difficulties with that corner, as Doriano Romboni would also end up going deep again, this time going off the track, whilst Norik Arbi would have a high side off his Yamaha, leaving him limping as a result and bringing his race to an end. Whilst that was happening, Doohan, who had finally managed to get into the groove, would re-overtake Barros to move back up into the podium places. In front and on lap 3, Criville would briefly overtake Cadalora into turn 5 just as the TV director decided to go to a replay before Cadalora would get him back again into turn 6 just as he did on the first lap. But heading into the final corner, Criville would finally complete the move on Cadalora to finally take the lead of the race, leaving the Italian into the clutches of Mick Doohan, who had caught up to the pair whilst they were battling. Behind, and Daryl Beattie would end his race at the exit of turn 10, also suffering from a high side like Arbe did, and would also end up limping just like the Japanese rider did, with his bike even catching fire as a result of the impact. A bit later on in the race, specifically on lap 7, Doohan, after being stuck behind for so long, which even allowed his other teammate Tadayuki Okada on the satellite spec Honda to catch up, would briefly unseen by the cameras get by on Cadalora into the final corner before the Italian would get him back again into turn 1. Doohan would try again to pass him into turn 2, but would end up making contact with Cadalora, being lucky not to end each other's races. But eventually, heading into turn 6, once again unseen by the cameras, Doohan would finally get by on Cadalora to move up into second place, with his sights now firmly set on trying to catch Criville in front. Seriously, the TV director on this day had an absolute howler, so many overtakes being missed due to ill-timed replays. Whilst Doohan was catching up to Criville, who himself had made a couple of errors allowing Doohan to eat into his lead, their other teammate Okada had himself been putting pressure on Cadalora, with the pair swapping places left, right and centre, with Luca being able to repass the Japanese rider on the straights due to the straight line speed advantage the factory spec Honda had compared to the satellite spec. Should be worth noting that even though the NSR 500V was built with the intention of having satellite teams run it, it was only Okada and Ito, who were contracted to Repsol Honda, that ended up running those bikes, with all the satellite Honda teams instead running the factory spec bike. Why that was the case I have no idea, but here we are. Lap 15, and after many laps of grinding, Doohan would finally catch up to the back of Criville, with the Spanish fans trying to roar Alex on in trying to fend off from the Australian, even letting off fireworks between turns 9 and 10 to show their mad support to the home hero. Though the let off of fireworks would end up becoming a foreshadow for what would happen later on. With 12 laps to go, the first warning signs would start to emerge, as heading into the first corner, fans could be seen sitting on top of the concrete barrier on the approach to turn 1 with their legs hanging over it. At this point, it was very clear there had been a security breach, but despite this, no one was seemingly doing anything to try and escort those spectators away. Thankfully, those set of fans wouldn't end up jumping onto the track, but if the fireworks from turn 9 were a foreshadow, then this was an even bigger one. Back on track, and Criville was doing a good job fending off from Doohan, but with how much the Spaniard was holding up the Australian, it allowed Cadalora, who had managed to pull away from Okada, to close up onto the pair of them. Cadalora would hang on to them for a few laps but would eventually drop off, leaving it as a showdown between the two factory-spec Repsol Honda riders. Even with the pressure Doohan was mounting, Criville was doing a good job to resist it, and with how well he was defending, it was looking like that Alex would take his first win at Jerez. But with 3 laps to go, trouble would start to loom on the racetrack, as between turns 9 and 10, which was where the fireworks were set off 10 laps earlier, fans could be seen spilling onto the track, with more fans continuing to enter as the race reached the penultimate lap. Heading on to the final lap, and as both Criville and Doohan made their way to turn 9, more fans could be seen invading the track, with many on the gravel trap getting too close to the action, similar to how spectators would view a stage of the World Rally Championship. This made, for a brief time at least, very uncomfortable to watch, but thankfully to the relief of everyone, no fan was struck by any of the riders. But whilst negotiating the double right-hander, Alex was forced to lift off the throttle slightly to avoid the chance of collecting a spectator. In doing so, Doohan, who had kept the throttle pinned, managed to get a good run on Alex at the exit of turn 10 and would continue to follow him through the fast right-handers. Heading into the final corner of Ferrari, which nowadays is known as Lorenzo Corner, Doohan would manage to get enough momentum to go down the inside of his teammate to try and grab the lead. Alex, desperate to try and hang it around the outside, would end up getting onto the marbles and end up spinning up the rear, launching him into a high side and taking himself out of the race. Doohan, seeing Criville crash in his mirrors, would blast down the pit straight to take his second win of the season, with Cadalora and Okada assuming second and third respectively from the Spaniard. Alex, understandably, would end up being furious by the whole chain of events, as a certain victory had been taken away from him due to the lunacy of his own fans. Doohan, after avoiding being mugged by the fans during the cooldown lap, would take to the top step of the podium to a chorus of boos, with those fans blissfully unaware that they were the reason that their home hero ended up losing the race. Now, it must be said, whilst those fans do have to take responsibility for putting their own lives at risk, Jerez themselves also have to take accountability for this, as they allowed the breach to happen in the first place, with no security seemingly being bothered to try and stop this from happening. Now, I have read that apparently the reason why this happened was because the commentator on the circuit speaker system said it was the last lap when the riders were on the penultimate lap. And whilst that might be true, that for me doesn't explain why the spectators got on the circuit, because even before the announcer allegedly said that, fans were still seen spilling onto the track the lap before, and there were even fans sitting on top of the concrete barrier on the approach to turn 1. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think the circuit commentary had anything to do with it. To me, it was a clear security breach that allowed that situation to happen, a situation that seemingly no one was trying to prevent. Whilst the accident that Criville had would not be Doohan's fault, it would end up being the catalyst for their intense rivalry for the next few years, with the pair getting into a lot of intense battles, which at times even led to accidents, with the 1996 finale at Sydney being the most notable, when after Doohan made contact with Criville on the last lap, Alex would end up tagging the back of Doohan heading into turn 9, leading to the pair of them falling off their bikes and costing themselves a 1-2 finish, leading to a war of words between the pair of them after the race had come to a close.
You lean on the right. No, you weren't. I was on the inside. You know what racing is? I was on the inside. I was in front of you. Your perception of racing needs to be fine-tuned, I think.
During the years that they would fight for the title, Doohan would come out on top in all of them, adding 3 more titles to the ones he got in 94 and 95, before Criville would finally take his first and only Premier Class title in 99 as a result of Doohan suffering a career-ending injury during qualifying at a rain-affected Jerez. Their rivalry in MotoGP is still talked about to this very day, but the events of Jerez 96 still leave a bad taste for many fans in the years afterwards.